Now, I know there's a lot of weapons tier lists out there, but to me, a lot of them are very one-dimensional and therefore incomplete. They talk a lot about DPS output of the weapons and also what the top tier players in the game are currently using, and therefore the weapons that you should be using. But to me, the situation is far more complex. It matters a lot whether you can hit the majority of the bullets in the clip size of the weapon you're using, and the defenses of the target you're shooting at. There are tons of breakpoints within the weapons themselves where they become more or less effective depending on your level of accuracy. A lot of these changes in the weapon's performance rely a lot on the reload. So if you have to reload an engagement versus not based on how accurate you were with the weapon, that will make a big difference in the overall time to kill for the weapon itself. We'll also be using stats like time to empty, which is how long it takes for you to empty all the ammo in your clip, as well as the defenses your enemy has. Do they have a helmet? Do they have body armor? And how big is the magazine that you're currently using? Some weapons that seem very popular right now in some scenarios are actually not your best choice. And conversely, there are some weapons that are kind of looked at as maybe iffy, but maybe very good for you. You may be experiencing some of this in your games where you say, hey man, the Spitfire or the Flatline works great for me. Everyone says they're not that great, but I get a lot of kills with them. I'm about to go into the math as to why that is. So firstly, I'll put a link down in the description for the calculator that I created. This is a free spreadsheet for anyone to use. To use it, just go ahead and go to File, make a copy on your own so you can edit any values you want. Enter values into the orangish yellow area on the side here. Everything else is calculated automatically, so don't touch those values. But you're going to be entering in the weapon that you're currently using, the accuracy or what you think your accuracy is, and how many times your shots actually result in a headshot, your headshot frequency. Along with that, you'll enter in whether you have a mag attachment on your weapon. This will make a big difference, especially for weapons like the SMGs that have small clips to start. And the bigger that clip gets, the less likely you are to have to reload, which is great. And then whether or not the enemy you are shooting at has body armor or helmet armor and what tier that armor is, as that will make a big difference overall. A small little interesting tidbit is the helmets in the game actually reduce the damage of the whole hit taken, not just the bonus extra damage you're taking from the headshot. So when you look at damage reduction, like 10% for the white helmet and 25% for purple and legendary, this may seem like a small amount, but it's actually more than it leads on because it's applying that damage reduction to the entire hit you're taking, not just the headshot bonus. So keep that in mind. Also note that the Havoc and Devotion are treated as if they are fully spun up in this calculator. I don't have accurate spin up values or curves for these weapons, and I didn't want to try and approximate it and get it wrong. So these are going to be at the top of the list always because it's treating as if you started the engagement as if they're spun up, which is very similar to how they'll perform if you have a turbocharger attached to them. The stats you'll want to pay attention to as you're entering in different scenarios into this calculator are going to be the number of reloads for a kill and the shots needed for a kill. You'll also see the time to kill and true DPS on the right side. True DPS meaning this is the amount of damage you were dealing per second, including your missed shots and the amount of reload time you've spent in the fight itself. So this will be basically for the length of the engagement until you got that kill, how much DPS you were dealing every second. And the time to kill is basically how long it took for you to kill that target with that current weapon with your accuracy percentage. Now, knowing this, you'll see some of the time to kills jump up by 2 or 3 seconds when you're entering in some of these values. And that just means that you likely incurred a reload based on your accuracy and the size of the clip for the weapon you're using. So this is kind of a big thing about whether or not you're able to kill the target. And you actually will probably see this in your games as well, using weapons like the R99 that have to be reloaded a lot, or the new Wingman. If you run out of ammo and have to reload, sometimes switching to your secondary, if the target is low on HP, is going to be faster than incurring the full reload. Now up on screen, I've put all the weapons into 2 different buckets. An early game bucket where the enemy has no armor, no helmet, and your weapon has no attachments, which means no magazine attachments, and a mid to late game bucket where the enemy has at least blue armor, a blue helmet, and you have the maximum magazine capacity possible. And so you look at this from 3 different specific scenarios. The first scenario being the average player. The average accuracy for most players in most FPS games is between 18 to 30% usually. So this is going to take into account a 30% accuracy and a 10% headshot frequency. That means that of all your shots, 1 in every 10 shot is a headshot, which is pretty common for your average player. A move up to about a mid-tier bracket, and above average player in a shooter game will have about 50% accuracy and about 20% headshot frequency. So this is your kind of above average, just below pro kind of player. And then the top tier bucket is going to be your top players, players that have played professionally before or are currently playing professionally. They will usually average around 60 to 70% accuracy with 30 to 40% headshot frequency, which is actually very, very high. So this last bucket takes into account 70% accuracy and 30% headshot frequency. So you can see that the time to kill changes pretty drastically between these buckets, and that's mainly because as you get better with accuracy, you have to reload less often, and you'll be able to secure that kill. Plus the added frequency of headshots will mean that you'll have that extra boost on specific weapons, especially like the longbow or the G7 Scout, where headshots can mean a lot with the headshot scaling. You'll also see, as I've highlighted each weapon with the same color, some very common popular weapons as they move across the chart. Weapons like the Peacekeeper will actually get less effective the more accurate you are, and that's because no matter what, the Peacekeeper will always require at least 2 shots to kill a target unless they have no helmet, no armor. But a lot of that comes down to just being able to hit all that in one shot, and the refire rate of the Peacekeeper is 1.03, which is pretty long, right? So if you're actually really accurate with your shots, the SMGs, ARs, and LMGs are far more effective in an engagement than the Peacekeeper. But what you'll see people do is shoot the Peacekeeper once and switch over to, especially an SMG, which has a faster swap speed, then you'll be able to get that damage finished off. It's just the Peacekeeper has a huge burst, but a lot of times to get the kill, you have to wait for the second or third shot, which will make a big difference. You also look at weapons like the R99. When you first land, where you are an average player in the very early game, no one has any armor, you'll see that the R99 is actually quite low, 3.78 TTK, or time to kill in seconds, and that's just because you probably will have to reload at least once to get that kill. But as you get better and you're missing less shots, which means you can actually kill the target in one clip, that 3.78 turns down into a 0.78 or even a 0.56 as you get more headshots in the mix. And then interesting, if you look at the mid to late game setup, for the average player, the R99 will be about 5.39 seconds. But for the above average player who can hit enough shots, the other weapons become far more effective, right? The R301, very consistent and reliable weapon, fast TTK at high accuracy or even at low accuracy as well. It's just a very reliable weapon. I also want to point out the Spitfire and the Flatline, and these weapons are actually pretty damn consistent. The Spitfire, it's because it has a large clip, and that means that regardless of your accuracy, you're unlikely to need a reload during the fight. And so for a lot of players, the Spitfire can be a very consistent, reliable weapon. And the Flatline for a similar reason, but it actually has a pretty high damage per shot relative to other weapons. And so these two weapons are actually, for most players, a really good pickup, because they mean that no matter how you're playing that day, it's going to be a rather consistent experience versus weapons like the R99 and the Peacekeeper, who may fluctuate depending on how well you're aiming and how much armor the enemy has. It's also important to note that both the Hemlock and the Prowler have lower DPS with their burst function, and that's just because you're just incurring the burst delay time, whereas if you were firing Hemlock single at maximum fire rate, and of course the Prowler auto with decent accuracy, the DPS will be higher. So the Spitfire auto is actually lower than I'd like to see it be, especially since you need an attachment for it. In almost all cases, the Prowler auto is worse than the Flatline, the Spitfire, the Carbine, the R301, the R99, which don't need attachments to fire with automatic, and then the Prowler burst is even worse than that. So I think, honestly, if I had to seek out an attachment for the Prowler to get its DPS up, I would hope that it would be better than just the baseline weapons like the R99 and the R301 and even the Hemlock, right? It's kind of sad to see that drop so low. Also, looking at the Wingman, since the clip size nerf, this dropped it down quite a bit, actually. You can see the Wingman on the lower end in almost all scenarios. That's just because the clip size is so small now that you have to reload at almost every encounter. And so the Wingman is actually a better option for mid to long range than it is up for short range. And it actually does have a really good, consistent damage output at long range. The weapon itself does have good projectile speed, so it can travel pretty far and pretty effectively, but also has a max headshot distance pretty close to a AR carbine, which is is pretty surprising for a pistol. So I think the Wingman is more of just a mid to long range poke weapon than it is an overall damage output close range. And I think a lot of players are seeing that on the most recent patch. And again, what shocked me as well is weapons like the Mastiff at medium to high accuracy still isn't better than your kind of core R301, R99 Spitfire, just because if you can hit most of those shots, it just doesn't overpower. If you're pretty inaccurate with your shots at the lower end, the Mastiff is probably one of the best weapons you can pick up, and it should be because it is those rare legendary weapons. But I'm kind of disappointed to see how low it drops when you're that accurate. And I think it also shows the meta we're in right now, where you're using a lot of SMGs and ARs, and in some cases, some LMGs. This calculator also shows how weak the Mozambique actually is, because when you start including accuracy percentages in with the Mozambique, it starts to drop almost to a pathetic level. It's pretty bad looking at what the weapon itself can put out. I think the two best ways to address this with the Mozambique is, one, to increase the number of pellets it shoots. Shooting 3 pellets for a shotgun is rather pitiful. You usually generally like to see between 8 to 15 just to get a decent spread so you make sure you hit your target so much. Shooting 3 pellets is why you also feel like sometimes you shoot at a target, you see the visuals, but you don't get a hit. It almost feels like a whiff, and it's because it's just not shooting enough pellets for what it does. On top of that, the clip size being 3 for the damage output it has, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'd like to see either the clip size increase, but I think the best change for the Mozambique, honestly, would be just to increase the pellet count that it fires. You can even keep the same DPS on it, but making sure that you can actually be quite consistent with the amount of shots that are coming out would make this a little bit more reasonable of a weapon. I mean, even comparing it to P2020, RD45, or the other early game weapons that aren't really meant to be taken into the late game, which I'm sure they don't want the Mozambique carried at the end of the game, it's not really even doing its job as a good early game option. I also would like to see some changes to the alternator. In the early game, when the target has no armor or no helmet and you have decent accuracy, the alternator is actually not bad. It can be pretty consistent. The problem comes when you start adding in blue armor, purple armor, or helmets into the mix. The alternator just falls completely to the wayside. The amount of damage it can deal out is pretty pitiful, and you do actually have to reload quite a bit to get the kill. So it's more of a good early game transitioning into mid-game kind of situation, but you're going to find a better weapon anyway, so throwing the alternator away in most scenarios except for right when you land is pretty much your best bet. I want to talk briefly about something that doesn't get talked about a lot either, and that's going to be the swap speed between weapons. Some weapons take longer to pull out than others, and this generally makes sense for like LMGs or big weapons, but it's good to know, at least in the back of your mind, what you're switching to and how long it's going to take. SMGs and pistols are far faster. The Wingman is only a quarter of a second versus the 0.7 seconds you'll get for the Spitfire or the Devotion. So these values are something just to keep in mind, especially if you're thinking about, should I reload or should I swap to a secondary weapon? If it's a Devotion or a Spitfire, or maybe even a sniper rifle like the longbow or the triple take, it will take almost a full second to swap to those weapons. Should also be aware of the reduction in movement speed while aiming down sights for some of these weapons. Most of them are around what you'd expect. I mean, generally ADS speed is between 40 and 60%. It's around half, but some of these weapons are actually full on high speed. So if you look at the Mozambique, the P2020, and the Wingman, you can actually move at full speed while holding down the aim down sights for these weapons. The sniper rifles are obviously the slowest at 36%, but what struck me as pretty odd was the fact that Peacekeeper and EVA 8 were almost at 100% strafe while aiming down sights, and I would honestly expect to see that to be more of a hip-fire movement than a 91%, especially the Peacekeeper itself, which isn't really meant to be a combat shotgun like the EVA 8, but that one kind of stuck out to me as a little strange. And that's it. If you guys are looking for a really cool way to improve your accuracy when you're playing a game, click on the card above or down below in the description for my How to Improve Your Aim in 10 Minutes video. And a big shout out to my supporters that have been supporting me through my journey so far. If you guys didn't know, I did actually quit my job so I could spend all my time creating content just like this in this video. So leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and check out my live stream, twitch.tv/drybear. I stream every single weekday and on most weekends. I'll see you in the next one.